are not just skilled in tangible objects, but you're also skilled with intangible media, namely words, and you're a poet and you're a writer. Can you tell us a bit about your journey into wordsmithing, I guess?
We also don't know when I started writing poetry. To be clear, it's not that my parents or that the people supervising me at any given time weren't attentive. It's just I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and micromanaging your children's time was not a thing. Nor were seatbelts, or, there's a lot of things that weren't a thing. I grew up in the era of get your butt out the door and don't come back until there are bats, right? So I go play outside. No video games, no computers, no internet, none of that. And television had a really limited scope as well. So I was just doing stuff, right? Some enterprising reporter at some point may end up door stopping my mother and extracting some horrific poem from, my elementary school days. Dad is convinced that he's got one of my poems on the wall in his workshop at the house in the basement. But I actually think that was a quote that I copied down on a bad drawing of a horse. Bless him. He's like, no, I have your first poem. I don't think that it is, Dad, but I really appreciate that you think so. So I've been writing them down probably, Mom says, since I learned how to write, which was probably first grade at most, at most recent. I was always pretty verbal, and I just memorized things. I'd write things, I'd memorize them, and I'd recite them before I could write them down. I'd just do that. So I've been doing that essentially forever from the perspective of the embodied poetics. And I was the poet laureate of San Francisco, and I'll tell you why that happened. It wasn't necessarily because I was a spectacular poet. It was because at some point I don't like the politics of the primary poetic outlet in San Francisco. I didn't like the politics of it. I mean, the writing.
Can you elaborate
fine.
a bit?
There was a lot of sexism.
I see.
The guys who were running the poetry scene that was most easily accessible were what we used to call back then handsy, and what we would now call abusive. And I didn't like it. I found it to be a distraction from the art. And I wanted there to be a scene that I wanted to be part of. Which is not to say, again, the work was spectacular, but when you're distracting me by putting your hands on me without permission, or by the continual, I mean, there was a time when I was somebody that kind of guy would pay attention to. And weirdly, that doesn't seem to have faded entirely. I'm like, eventually I will be old enough to where they stop doing that. But now I'm still in a range where it's a power play, where like low-grade sexual harassment is like a thing that people do to make sure you're not in charge of the room. And I am so sarcastic that I also think now people in some ways do it in order to see what I'll say, which is usually scathing and hilarious. It's just disappointing because we have so much better stuff to do. Anyway, I started running a poetry series. I was curating poetry at the university I was teaching at before I left that job. And then I decided, for a number of reasons, some of them my fault, some of them just the really bad politics of the situation, that I would leave that job and dedicate myself to my artwork, whatever that meant in any moment. And I only briefly went back to having an actual job for a little while, because when I first started going out with my current partner, his knees were bad and he was going to have to retire, and I thought I might have to support him. So I went back to a university position and then left that, because again, I am really bad at managing the politics of those situations. I don't understand why it has to be like, you know, the high school cafeteria politics. It's really stupid. And the weird jealousies and the strange, just all of it. It just makes no sense to me. I mean, you would think we would know better, but apparently we do not. So I started doing a poetry series that was directed at Native American poets. So I'd put Native American poets on stages around the city.
Around San Francisco.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I was reading my own stuff over in Oakland, because I liked the scene there better. And it was, for the most part, less sort of acquisitively sexual politic nonsense, you know, just to say you could, you know, kind of thing. So at that time, I was running a series, and then they put me in between these two incredibly famous African American poets, and it would go one or the other, the other one, and you couldn't. It was really intimidating, and I think it was good for me, even though it was uncomfortable, because it made me really confident about what I brought to the game. I learned over the course of many, many readings what I was bringing to the dance on that. Started getting my stuff published, which I'd never done.
What were you bringing? What is your special?
I'm
if you had to describe your poetry and...
Well, in contrast with theirs, so we're all three of us very political poets. My politics may be a bit more subtle.
What is a political poet?
So, if you look at some of the traditional, mostly English canon of poetry as is taught in American schools, and you find I wandered lonely as a cloud, and I don't have in my life the latitude to just write about that. When I was a much younger poet, I wrote about flowers. And when politics get stable, I will go back to writing about flowers, but nobody's holding their breath.